Welcome, everybody, to the May edition of the American Promise National Call, which is a very special edition because it is also the inaugural call for our Citizen Leaders Book Club. If you don't know me, my name is Kimberly Clinch, and I am the Citizen Empowerment Coordinator here at American Promise, and here to tell us a little bit more about the agenda tonight and what you can expect is American Promise founder and president, Jeff Clements. If I can find him, I'll take him off mute.
Right here.
And
I think I'm off mute.
awesome.
Kimberly.
Take it away, Jeff.
How are you? Hey, good to see everybody. We still have people pouring in. Over 200 signed up for this call. We're thrilled. We're so glad to have Neal Simon and all of you with us today. Our mission, as you know, is to unite and empower all Americans to build a strong republic and a healthy democracy. Number one on our to-do list is bringing Americans together across partisan lines to win the next amendment to the U.S. Constitution, put power in the hands of the American people instead of concentrated money and big special interests so that we can control our destiny. These monthly calls are a special treat we all look forward to at American Promise, where we share best practices and strategies and connect together for powerful action around the country. And as Kimberly said this evening, we're delighted to have this special edition where we're launching the Citizen Leaders Book Club and welcoming many of our friends. In addition to Neal Simon and his new book, Contract to Unite America, 10 Reforms to Reclaim Our Republic, we're really pleased and grateful and proud to be working with and have here tonight our partners in this launch event. Issue One, and I believe Nick Penniman, the founder and CEO of Issue One, is on the call. Unite America, Charlie Whelan and Nick Troiano may be on the call and joining us, the founder and executive director of Unite America. The Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I know I saw Glenn Nye, former congressman and president and CEO of the Center for the Study of Presidency and Congress. Thank you. And our friends at the Congressional Management Foundation and Brad Fitch I saw coming onto the call. So we are really delighted to work with those outstanding organizations to bring this great conversation to you and via our YouTube channel afterwards and in the weeks and months ahead to all Americans around the country. I'm going to introduce Neal in just a minute or two. We'll have a conversation about his book and this movement. You'll be part of that conversation. Everyone is on mute now, but we will unmute you so you will be able to join the conversation, and I'll explain how to do that in just a minute. We'll then wrap up with Neal around 8:35 and go into the next phase of these national calls, which you'll want to stick around for if you're new to American Promise. And of course, if you are a member of American Promise, it's a really special citizen leader victory story this month, as we hear from both Judy Nagel and Hauser in Green Bay, and how they used the American Promise strategies, their business leadership and community leadership for very effective advocacy with Congressman Mike Gallagher to actually move forward not one, but two of the constitutional reforms that Neal has in his book, among the others. So let's dive in with Neal. I think, Kimberly, we're going to want to keep everyone on mute until we get to the question time. And that is, you can start sending your questions by chat. As many of us now know on Zoom, the chat button is on the bottom. If you click on that, it'll open a sidebar. Anytime, just weigh in, share a comment, ask a question. I'll try to get that into the conversation with Neal. And then we'll have a time we can open up your mic and just use the raise your hand feature, and we'll take hands and open up the mics as we can get as many of you into the conversation as we can. To do that, you go to the bottom of the screen and you'll see a participants button. Just click on that button, you'll find your name, and the button beside that, raise hand, to raise your hand, and that'll come up on our screen so that we can take your question. So let's dive in. I think if you put it on speaker view, you might be able to see Neal, which I'm going to do because I'd like to see Neal Simon come on up. And thank you again, Neal, for being with us. Let me say a few words about Neal's background. If you've read the book, you know this. He is in many ways the American story. His grandparents on his father's side came here from Belarus. His mother is an immigrant from Morocco. Through hard work, family, education, service to others, service to country, he has had a successful business career, a career of public service, a 4-time CEO, and I may have just given him a promotion. He'll correct me if that was wrong, and he's a 3-time CEO. But most recently at Groff and Rothschild, political and community service, ran for the Senate, U.S. Senate in Maryland as an independent on a reform platform. His service on nonprofit boards earned him and his family Interfaith Humanitarian of the Year award, and he's on the board today of Unite America and Bipartisan Policy Center. He's a big voice in this growing new reform movement that we are all a part of. And his book, in many ways, if you've had a chance to read it, you know, is in many ways the manifesto of this new movement to renew America. So welcome, Neal Simon. Neal, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're unmuted. And please tell us a little bit about what you were trying to do with this book, what it's all about, and then we'll dive in. Neal.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks to your whole team. You guys are always so great to work with. And thanks to all those other amazing reform organizations that you mentioned invited people to this call tonight. One of the great things that came out of my campaign was the relationships with so many patriotic, committed Americans who think we deserve a government that's better than the one we've got now and that functions better and more constructively. And a lot of the people on this call represent that type of American that I got to know during the campaign. So what's the book about? In a lot of ways, the book is about the incentives in our political system. So as a candidate and as a lawmaker, if you want to be elected or you're already elected and you like your job, what are your incentives? What helps you get elected or get reelected? And the book is largely told through stories, some from my campaign, some from other campaigns around the country. And it describes how, as a candidate or lawmaker, you have almost every reason to appeal to one base or the other, either the base of the Democratic Party or the base of the Republican Party, and almost no reason to work across the aisle to come up with compromise solutions, to collaborate for the long-term good of the country, but really every reason to appeal to one base or the other. And the book, in the end, is really about 10 very specific reforms. So the subtitle of the book that Jeff mentioned is 10 Reforms to Reclaim Our Republic. And it's about those 10 reforms. So I'll take a minute or two right now just to introduce some of the concepts in the book. And then, Jeff, I'll let you ask questions. And I know we both love to hear from the audience here. But think about it for a minute. If you're someone who wants to be in Congress, and you looked at the landscape and you think about, what would I do if I really wanted to be elected? The first thing you'd figure out is that 90% of House races are uncompetitive in the general election, and 70% of Senate races. So what that means is that one party, the majority party in that jurisdiction, has an advantage of at least 5% in the last few elections. So once you understand that in almost every jurisdiction, it's like that, you say, okay, if I want to be elected, what I need to do is win the primary for that majority party. So you start thinking about, all right, how do I do that? So who votes in that primary? And it tends to be the Democratic primary voters tend to skew far left. The Republican primary voters tend to skew far right. And so you understand that, okay, that's who I have to appeal to. And it's a very small number of voters. Typically only about 20% of registered voters vote in those primaries. And in 20 states in this country, independents aren't even allowed to participate in those primaries. So you start with that incentive. Then you add money. So to win a campaign, and this is something as a candidate you really learn and feel and understand, but you need money to campaign. And the money also skews to the far left and to the far right. It's very ideologically driven. So if you want to raise the significant amounts of money that it costs, you again have an incentive to appeal to one of the ideological bases. And these days, the money is basically limitless and often anonymous. And this is some of the great work that Jeff and his organization are doing to change. And you go on from there, the way our elections work, the way ballot access works, the way debates work. We can dig into any of these things, but really every incentive you have is to appeal to the base in order to be elected for the first time and then in order to stay elected. And that's not consistent with the same things that are needed to run this country in a really effective way. So that's a lot of what the book is about. And it's told through stories. Some of them are funny, some of them are really serious and sad, but hopefully you'll all get a chance to read it and learn from it.
Well, I certainly hope so, Neal, and I know many on the call already have. I'll just share a couple of the comments coming in. Contract to Unite America is brilliant, great research, well written. Thanks to Peter Garrett, who I know well up in Maine, has got that comment. And Brad Fitch, as I mentioned at the Congressional Management Foundation, has described the bibliography alone as a gift to American democracy, one of the most thoroughly researched books he has seen. And I can attest to that as well. It's just a terrific book. Like so many of us see, you kind of start in a bit of a dark place. The stories are wonderful, and in the end, it is, and throughout, it's inspiring and a call to action. But you kind of lay out the situation we're in with some pretty tough facts. You don't have to go past page 6 or 7 to see the dysfunction, the division, the domination by money that you mentioned, the sort of systemic breakdown of our institutions. What is happening? I know you look at the incentives that are driven there, but why is it all happening at once? And how is it too late, or can we get this fixed in time?
So some of the results that Jeff is talking about that are so disheartening when you look at them are statistics like Congress has an approval rating that has fluctuated between 14 and 20%. Think about that. Only 14 to 20% of us think that our legislative body is doing a good job. The amount of legislation that comes out of Congress has plummeted. The amount of bipartisan legislation has reached nearly zero until this corona crisis, and maybe we'll talk about that. But it used to be that major legislation was passed by Congress on a bipartisan basis. People forget that the Civil Rights Act was passed by a majority of both parties. That major legislation for years was passed by the majority of both parties. And it's only in the last couple of decades where you have the biggest pieces of legislation, whether it was on healthcare when the Democrats jammed something down the throats of the Republicans, or whether it was the tax cut bill where it happened in reverse, both on party line votes. That's a recent phenomenon. Well, you also see it with judicial confirmations. It was during Reagan's presidency when he nominated Anthony Kennedy, who was approved, I think it was 97-0. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg, nominated by Bill Clinton, was approved 96-3. And think about how that compares to the Kavanaugh hearings when you have straight party line votes. So we know we have a completely dysfunctional Congress right now. But the book does end on a hopeful note. I do think that there are things we can do. Every one of those 10 reforms is supported by at least 60% of Americans. So Americans know that we need the system to work better. One of the problems is that the political insiders in both parties tend to fight against whichever reform will disadvantage them in their particular jurisdiction. And that's one of the challenges that we all have. But we've done this before. This country has reformed its political system before. 100 years ago, we went through the progressive era. Many of you, I'm sure, have read about it. And what happened was we had a wave of reforms that happened over 20 years that gave women the right to vote for the first time, that enabled all of us to elect our senators through direct elections for the first time. And there were other reforms as well. So they tend to happen in waves. They tend to start at the local and state level. which is what's happening now, and then crescendo into national changes.
Yeah. Well, let's unpack a little bit. I know there are quite a few questions on how we can actually move it forward, and state versus Congress. How do we, if all these incentives and structural blockages, if you will, are there now, how are we actually going to break through with that big response? But before we get there, I want to, especially for those who haven't had a chance to get through the book, the mystery is the 10 great reforms that are going to do it, and they are. I quite agree. Tell us a bit more, unpack them a little bit. Why these reforms, how will they work? Give us some examples of what these reforms look like and why they can unravel the sort of dysfunction and get us back on track.
6 of the reforms are electoral reforms. So they are about how we perform our elections, and I'll dig into that. 2 of them are campaign finance reforms, including the Jeff Clements and American Promise 28th Amendment. Is one of them. And then 2 of them are really about how we behave. One about the country and creating a culture of unity, and one about some specific changes to the way Congress works once Congress is elected. So in the electoral reforms, one is about gerrymandering, and we can dig into that. So we talked about how 90% of House districts are uncompetitive. Some of that is because we have politicians drawing the lines. We have politicians choosing their voters rather than the other way around. And if we had independent commissions drawing those lines, rather than 90% uncompetitive elections, it would probably be something more like 75%. So gerrymandering alone, I know people think it's a big issue, and it is a huge issue, but it's not a silver bullet. It will solve some of the problem. Another one of the reforms is about opening primaries. So I'm an independent. I'm a political independent. My 3rd child, who is 17, recently registered to vote, because in Maryland you register when you get your license, and all 3 of them have registered as independents. They and I are not allowed to vote in primaries where we live, which are arguably the most important election, even though we pay for those elections. Those are taxpayer-funded electoral activities that essentially determine who will be our elected representative. We're not allowed to vote. So one of the chapters is about opening primaries. One is about the way debates work. And there's some funny stories about my personal experience with the debates were the highlight of my campaign in 2018. But unfortunately, once they were such a highlight, the incumbent would no longer show up to any debates. So, and they have a lot of leverage there. And I think Americans deserve to learn who the candidates are and see them head to head and ask them questions. One's about ballot access. So a lot of people don't really understand, how do you get your name on a ballot? So if you're running for office, what is the process that you go through to actually be listed on that ballot? And the 2 parties have co-opted that process to make it very, very, very difficult to challenge from outside the 2-party system. And it's, by the way, it's not supposed to be that way. I think most of you probably understand that there is no reference to political parties in our Constitution. There's no reference to party primaries. None of this is in the Constitution. It's all just evolved, particularly over the last 100 years. So I'll leave it there. Those are a few examples. I don't think we want to go through all 10 right now and see what people are interested in talking about.
Yeah, there is a question on the open primaries from our friend Ellen Greenbush, who asks, there are some states that have sort of moved to try to open that up. California, it's sort of a blanket primary, I guess it may be called. Where is it working well anywhere? Is there a place you can point to, kind of the future on the primary issue?
So when I say open primary, what I mean is that anyone who is paying for that election, any registered voter, should be allowed to vote in any taxpayer-funded election. 30 states do that now. So 30 states actually have open primaries where you show up on election day. So in Virginia, the state next to me, you show up on election day. The state does not know what party you are registered with. And they say, thank you, Mr. Simon. Would you like the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot or Libertarian or Green Party, or what would you like? And you vote, and they don't keep track of your registration. That's an open primary. It works well in all 30 states. and voters have a right to voice their opinions in what is often the most important election in those states. In 20 states, to some degree, that's not true. And it varies state by state, where independent voters are shut out of those elections. I think you said Alan was his name. Alan was asking about, there are 2 states in this country that have what we call blanket primaries or jungle primaries, or some people call them non-partisan primaries, where you just have one big primary where everybody's running at the same time. And in those 2 states, they happen to make it top 2. So the top 2 winners move on to the general election. It's working okay, and there's some academic disagreement about how well it's working, but I think it is better than the normal system. Personally, I'd rather see it be top 4 or top 5, where you end up with more than 2 candidates moving to the general election. I think that would give voters more of a choice in the general.
Yeah, and then of course ranked choice voting you mentioned, and I see some big thumbs up in the chat for ranked choice voting, especially if you have 4 or 5 candidates moving on. You could then feel comfortable voting your choice, and lining up your choices and having not waste the sort of the spoiler effect. Can you explain that a little bit more? And ranked choice voting, of course, is a lot more people are hearing about it, but if you could just touch on briefly why that's so effective and catching on so fast.
Ranked choice voting might be the most effective of all the reforms. So ranked choice voting is exactly what it sounds like. If you're voting in an election and there are more than 2 candidates, then you rank the candidates. So if there are 4, you rank one number 1, one number 2, one number 3, one number 4. You don't have to rank all 4, but you can rank up to all of them if you want. And then what happens is, in the current system, if you have multiple candidates, very often a passionate plurality can take control of that election. So think about the 2016 Republican primary. All the way through Super Tuesday, I think there were only 2 states that Donald Trump got more than 40%. And he was rarely anyone's second choice. But yet, because it's a winner-take-all election that we call first past the post, the first person to get past the post, he's able to take control of that. Bernie Sanders almost did that in this Democratic primary this year. In Maine, in the last 13 gubernatorial races, 9 of the winners have gotten less than 50%. Even when most people oppose the eventual winner. So what ranked choice voting does, you rank the candidates, you end up with a winner who will ultimately have majority support. And it also encourages civility, because if Jeff and I are running against each other for office, and it'll be such a hard choice for all of you, I know, right? But what I wouldn't be doing is being out there saying Jeff's stupid and evil and terrible. I'd be saying, you know, I agree with Jeff on a lot of things, and here are a couple of things we disagree on, because I want his second place votes. So ranked choice voting also encourages civility. And it gets, at the end of the day, it gets at the core of the problem in our electoral system, because you have these winner-take-all, first-past-the-post elections. What happens is you naturally end up with a 2-party system. And naturally, over time, it becomes more and more and more polarized. There was a political scientist in the 1950s named Duverger, a French political scientist, who figured this all out. He said, when you have systems like ours, single member districts with first past the post voting, you will naturally over time have a 2-party system, and it will naturally become more and more polarized, and then more and more polarized. And that's what's happened to us. And it's what's going to continue to happen unless we change the way our system works.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some other ways of changing. I think, as people on this call know, many of you, on the ballot in Alaska this fall, with Unite America, American Promise, and open primaries and others supporting, the voters will have a chance to select, to decide they want ranked choice voting, they want disclosure of money, they want open primaries, and they want to be the 21st state to call for our anti-corruption, getting big money out of politics amendment. I thought it was kind of a nice, almost timed with your book release, that these things are actually coming together on ballots and moving ahead, because this is not sort of pie in the sky you're talking about. These are things that are actually moving already. Let's talk about the tough ones in terms of challenge to us as Americans to achieve. And that's, of course, constitutional amendments, some of the biggest things we do in America for our democracy. And you devote two of your big reforms to constitutional foundation building for this next generation of renewed democracy. Would you tell us a bit more about why those two amendments, how sort of, as you kindly put it, the American Promise Amendment to deal with the money problem, and the other one's term limits. How do those two work? How will they contribute to this sort of, I think of it as a virtuous cycle you're trying to generate to get us back to the incentives working to advance democracy?
The 6 electoral reforms are being addressed mostly at a state level. And for example, I talked about open primaries already exists in 30 states, and ranked choice voting just passed in Maine and is on the ballot, as you said, in some other places. There are 2 of the reforms that, for better or worse, require a constitutional amendment. And those are probably the 2 hardest to get done, but they're 2 of the most impactful, and they are the 2 most popular. So one is term limits, which is supported by 83% of Americans. And then the other is campaign finance reform, basically setting limits on the amount of money that can be spent. So giving the government, federal and state governments, the ability to set limits and the ability to say, listen, corporations can't spend limitless either. And term limits, which again is the most popular, is exactly what it sounds like. Americans want term limits. A lot of us will have forgotten that in the early 90s, 23 states passed term limits, not on the state legislatures, on their governors. Right now, I think it's 31 governorships are term limited, but they passed it on their federal representatives. So in the early 90s, there was a wave of reform where Americans voted to term limit their representatives in Washington, their representatives in the US House of Representatives and the Senate. And what happened is there was a Supreme Court ruling, 5-4 ruling, like a lot of these things are overturned, that said, no, you can't do that, states. States, you are not allowed to limit the amount of time that your representatives can serve in the federal legislature. So that was overturned, and then we had no term limits. So there's, like Jeff's group, American Promise, there's another group called US Term Limits that's fighting to get that done. I think the really interesting thing about those 2 amendments, and Jeff, you've really been a leader on trying to get this done, is that they can complement each other, and I think that they might help each other get done. So it turns out that term limits are a little bit more popular on the right, and that campaign finance reform is a little bit more popular on the left. And so possibly by putting these things together, we might have a better chance of getting some of this done or generating support for both at the same time.
Well, I think you'll want to stick around, everybody, to hear how Howard and Judy in Green Bay are working that strategy with Congressman Mike Gallagher and others, because I think that's quite right. It's sort of, to Congress, the message is kind of give Americans what they want, and both of these have overwhelming support in the country across partisan lines, but the opposite problem in Congress of trying to gather that kind of 2/3 level support that we'll need. There are a lot of questions coming in. There's some new people have joined as the call has gone on. We're glad to see you. Welcome. Please, again, go to the chat down below to click on chat or start rate and shoot a question or a comment. There's a lot pouring in. I'm sorry I can't keep up with them all, but I'm feeding as many as I can to Neal. And start raising your hand if you want to get on the mic and ask Neal a question. That is at participants down at the bottom, and you'll see the feature by your name to be able to raise your hand, and we'll try to get to your question. So let's go to the third big piece of what I think you're trying to tell the country, Neal, and your really brilliant call to action that Contract to Unite America is. And it seems like the third piece, after the constitutional reforms, the state-based and legislative reforms you talked about, is kind of a challenge to all of us as Americans and our representatives to basically be better citizens. What do you mean by that?
So the last chapter that Jeff's referring to, or the 10th reform, is called Creating a Culture of Unity. And it calls up, because I think that changing American politics at the end of the day is really up to us. If we always feel like it's up to other people, it will never get fixed. And so in that chapter, I call on the president to have a bipartisan administration. So at least to have members in the cabinet from the other party. People forget, in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election, he ran on a unity ticket and with a vice president from the opposing party. That's the last time that that's been done, but I think America is starved for that. When I was on the campaign trail in 2018, I remember a moment, it was after John McCain passed away, and I would talk about how John McCain said his greatest regret was that he did not appoint Joe Lieberman to be his running mate. So McCain, you'll remember, was a Republican. Lieberman was a Democrat for most of his political career. And instead, McCain ended up appointing Sarah Palin from Alaska. And he said that was his greatest regret. And when I would talk about that on the campaign trail, people would react wishfully, and they'd say things like, God, I wish that happened. Imagine how different things would be. And I think deep down the country is starved for that type of behavior. So in that chapter, I call for the president to do that, call for Congress to have a civility pledge. I call for more civic education, because I think one of the real tragedies in this country is how little Americans understand these days about how their government functions. You know, we've had a big appropriate emphasis on math and science in the last few decades, but I think one of the casualties of that has been civics and civics education, understanding how our government works. I cannot tell you how many times on the campaign trail I was out there and heard questions about our government that would floor all of you, that just demonstrated absolutely no knowledge of how our government.
Let me ask you, then I want to take, we'll go to Susan next, but I want to just ask you, Neal, quickly, if you could, to touch on something that has been a challenge for many in this time of crisis, when people are worried about voting safely and securely. It got partisan pretty quick. And, some are feeling like there's sort of a voter suppression going on. On the other side, there's accusations of somehow voting at home is fraud. How does that culture of unity succeed in times like this? Do you have any tips for doing this big cross-partisan unity work that we're trying to do?
I mean, first of all, it's hard, right? And I think the onus is on us, one, to very often ignore the bitter dialogue coming from our political leaders, right? Their incentive is to belittle each other, to yell at each other, to make everything black and white. And I think there's also an onus on us sometimes to ignore certain news media, or at least listen to both. Like, if you're going to spend 20 minutes listening to Fox, spend 20 minutes listening to CNN, or vice versa. And I think the onus is on us to be better consumers of political information, because this work is hard. But I do believe, I will tell you from having spoken to tens of thousands of people during my campaign, Americans deep down want us to come together. They want a government that functions better. And I think that deep down, we have leaders who are divisive and are dividing us. And that's more of the problem than Americans being naturally ideologically divided. When you ask Americans about ideology and about different political issues, they're generally not that far apart. It's that they're being pulled apart, I think, very often by leaders who have an incentive to do so.
Yeah. All right. Let's, Susan, Cynthia, if we could lower Susan's hand and let her ask her question to Neal.
My question is about term limits. I'm sort of ambivalent about it, and because I'm one of those civics persons who didn't know much about how the system operated. And I am absolutely floored with the complexity and what you need to know to be a legislator, let alone an effective one. And I'm thinking, I'm from the healthcare field, and I'm thinking it's sort of like, you want a neurosurgeon who's had 2 years experience, or do you want a neurosurgeon who's had 25? And I just find that there's something in having experience and credibility, and I'd just like you to sort of respond to that.
Sure. Listen, I wish we didn't need term limits. I wish we had a highly functional electoral system where you had new blood regularly, where our Congress got along well, worked together well. I wish we didn't need term limits. The reality is that incumbent reelection rates when they're running are 95%, sometimes as high as 97%. PAC money goes 90% to incumbents who become very good at playing the money game that Jeff and his group are fighting to reform. And some people talk about the experience. In the last few decades, the average tenure in Congress has doubled. And I would argue it's become a lot less functional, not a lot more functional. If that type of experience mattered that much, you would see a much more functional Congress because people are so experienced now. I think the type of experience that people are learning, what they're learning in Congress, is not how to effectively legislate and advance the interests of the average American. That's not what they're learning. What they're learning is how to fight partisan wars. How do I win the news cycle every day? They get really good at that. How do I raise money? How do I make my 73 fundraising calls in 6 hours today? That's what they get very, very good at. That's what experience gets you. And so, listen, I wish we didn't need term limits, but I think it would be a real healthy change in the start of a renaissance for our Congress. Another interesting thing is when people are against term limits, they talk about experience. Then I'll say, well, what about your governor? Right? 36 governors are term limited. They'll say, no, it's okay for the governor. What about for the president? Okay, it's okay for the president. So it becomes a tough argument to make that the experience is more relevant for the legislature than for the executive branch. But I think it would help turn things around.
Right. I'm afraid we are running out of time. I put a lot of the questions in to you, Neal, that have come up in the chat. I'm sorry there's a hand or two left that we're going to have to hold for next time or put it into the chat. We will follow up. There's some good links already, thanks to Brad Fitch and others who are putting up links in the chat, so check those out. And then there's questions and concerns about how we diversify this movement and really make it much more inclusive of all Americans that I know at American Promise we are working on and need to continue doing that. There's just a lot more of this conversation to be had. And I'm sorry we can't do it all tonight. But Neal, I hope you and everybody who's on the call, please stick around, because for the next few minutes, and the reason I want to make sure we have time for this is I'm going to turn it back to Kimberly. She's going to share some of how we're actually moving forward in this challenging environment to do some pretty big, cool citizen leadership work. So Neal, thank you so much. I hope we'll have you back again soon to continue this conversation, and we're so glad to have your book. I know I speak for all of us to say how valuable it is. If you want a copy of the book and you're not already a member of American Promise, we're giving it free this month to new members. Become a monthly donor and a member of American Promise. We'll send it to you. Get it at the American Promise store at americanpromise.net. There's another store called Amazon and a few others where you can probably get it too. But we're really glad to have it. Neal, thank you so much. And back to you, Kimberly.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Neal. And if you've got your video on, can I get some thumbs up and spirit fingers for Neal and Jeff? Yes, yeah, absolutely. That was a fantastic discussion, and I think one of my favorite parts was, pointing to history in the progressive era to remind ourselves that we have good cause to be optimistic. Looking to history, we know that reform in troubling times is not impossible, but actually inevitable. But for you to have heard that, you had to already be on this call. So I want to say thank you to everyone who is on this call, taking time to have the optimism that things can change, and to be an engaged and more informed citizen hearing from an independent. I'm reminded of the quote, I just pulled it up actually because I was reminded of it during listening to the chat. Optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy for us to think nothing is going to get any better. In fact, these days, cynicism is obedience. Optimism is a political act. So thank you, everyone, for having the optimism to be on tonight's call. And I am excited to pivot to the part of the call where we get to talk about the great progress that is being made on the solutions to the problems that we were just reviewing. If you are a member of American Promise, you know that we are in the business of making it good politics for our elected officials to support a constitutional amendment that will limit big money's influence in politics. And there was someone in the chat asked, how do we change the system when it benefits those who are in it? And as I like to say, we do that by making it good politics. We do that by empowering the 75% of Americans who want this amendment with the collective awareness about their shared goal and their shared power, with the information that change in this time is not impossible, but inevitable, and with information about where their elected officials stand so that they can put the pressure on their elected officials to change. As our friend and DC ally, Representative Jim McGovern, said on the January edition of this call, the one thing that all of us politicians have in common is we all want to get reelected. If there's enough pressure and the incumbents feel the pressure that this will matter in the next election, that will sway them. And so that is what we try to do. And to that end, I want to call out a few of the great contributions that have been made to that work. Even just since our April call, we've had a number of new authors contributing in the way of media pieces. Of course, we've got some of our usual suspects, but Elaine Hall in North Texas, Pat Brackley and Lois Peterson in Wyoming, and Barbara and Stephen Miller in New Jersey, all fantastic work getting media pieces submitted to spread awareness in your communities about the great progress to win a constitutional amendment that limits big money in politics. And we've also had pledge signatures collected up and down ballots across the country. So many Senate candidate in Georgia, U.S. representative candidates in New Mexico, Virginia, Ohio. But I did want to highlight two cool victories at the local level. In New Mexico, Brian Harris, local candidate in the Santa Fe area, used his pledge signature in one of his own campaign emails. So that was very cool to see. And in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Hal Gurian is running for Grand Traverse County Commissioner. If you guys haven't heard about Hal Gurian, he's a member of American Promise Grand Rapids and one of the dynamic duo, along with John Dispelder, who came to DC last October to meet with U.S. Representative Jack Bergman and subsequently spread word of their meeting throughout their community. And now Hal is running for Grand Traverse County Commissioner. So keep your fingers crossed that a fellow amendment advocate will soon be holding office. And segueing into our grassroots victory of the month, another great victory that happened was a meeting with one of our elected officials. And this story is an exciting example of how our longstanding approach here at American Promise of relationship building and meeting people where they are can come together with our fast-growing Business for American Promise network, as well as our even newer remote connection approaches. Judy Nagel and Howard Hauser in Wisconsin are business professionals who recently had a Zoom meeting with their U.S. Representative Mike Gallagher. Mike Gallagher is a Republican with whom we've had great conversations since last October's Lobby Day, building on his own passionate interest in a reform-minded constitutional amendment about term limits. So here to tell us more about that are Judy and Howard. If we can work to get Judy and Howard off mute, I'm going to turn it over to them. Judy, can we do a mic check on you?
Hello.
Awesome. Take it away.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. As Kimberly mentioned, I'm Judy Nagel. I'm a retired financial advisor from Wells Fargo Advisors. And after selling my book of business to a colleague last year, I've used my business experience to serve on 4 community boards and numerous different committees. So when the pay-to-play issue came to my attention, I needed to recruit someone to make this a bipartisan effort. And I went to one of my fellow Rotary members, and that, of course, was Howard. And Howard has become a very valued member of the team. And Howard will share with you how we approached our representative.
Hi, yes, I'm Howard Hauser. I'm a business consultant here in Green Bay. I've been doing that for quite a while. So also from a business background like Judy. Judy and I started, the first thing we did, we made a presentation to our Rotary Club, and we were both actually very surprised at the level of positive feedback that we got from everybody after the meeting. They come up, regardless of their party, their, how they felt. Everybody was enthusiastically saying, yeah, this is what we need. We need this kind of a change. And they offered, how can we help? So we've also recruited some additional resources here locally. This reinforced our feelings and our mission about making contact with Representative Mike Gallagher, to push this agenda with him. Judy worked locally with Gallagher's office, while American Promise, they worked with the DC staff to set up a meeting. After a few reschedules and some jockeying back and forth for times, we got an appointment and had a 4-way phone conversation with Rep. Gallagher, Judy, Jeff Clements, and me. The meeting went really well. Prior to the meeting, one of the things I think was extremely helpful, we had a meeting with Judy and me and American Promise, and we talked through the presentation. Their coaching was extremely helpful in helping us craft our experience and our message into a way that resonated with Rep. Gallagher. With that, I'll let Judy take it away and continue the story.
Well, also prior to the meeting, I had done an op-ed piece that I had written, and then there was information from American Promise that they provided. It was an article called "Why Pay to Play is a Losing Proposition for Business and Society." So we made sure that info was given to Mike Gallagher's staff and then passed along to him prior to our meeting. So when the meeting first started, Howard and I simply introduced ourselves to the representative. We each complimented him on some recent issue that he had an impact on. In my case, it was healthcare, because I chaired the Quality Care Committee for 2 local hospitals. We then each presented why we thought pay to play was an important issue to us. And then we asked him what his thoughts were on that issue. And then we both just kind of shut up and listened. At that point, after we had an opportunity to listen, Jeff Clements then added some information that supported Representative Gallagher's thoughts. We became aware that he was a very strong advocate for term limits. So we asked Representative Gallagher for his support on the pay-to-play amendment, but combined with the idea of term limits as well. So after the meeting was over, it was a very brief meeting, it was about 20 minutes. Both Howard and I sent thank yous to both Representative Gallagher and his support staff for having had the opportunity to meet with him. And then I believe Jeff is following up with Gallagher's staff in making some networking connections in regards to the term limit issue. Just a day or so ago, both Howard and I received a letter from the congressman highlighting the issues that he's been supporting. And in that letter, early in the letter, he states, like us, he believed Congress needs significant reform to restore it to the founders' vision. So that sounded fairly promising. And Jeff, are there any comments that you would like to make? Have you had a chance to do a follow-up?
Yeah, thanks, Judy, and thank you Thank you, Howard. Just terrific. And the context, folks, is we're not all of a sudden pivoting, let's do term limits now. The idea here is really something that our board member, Jim Rubens, who's a Republican in New Hampshire, and a big supporter of our amendment, also a supporter of term limits. And he calls this sort of the ultimate grand bargain to break through the logjam when you need 2/3 for a constitutional amendment. The challenge that we are offering, all you are offering, with this approach is really to say to Congress, look, if you really mean it, you got to get 290 votes in the House and you got to get 67 in the Senate. You're going to have to start talking to each other and working with each other. So we have at least 3 or 4, probably 4 on each side now talking to each other and saying, okay, let's let the horse trading and the learning from each other, just like we do here, begin, because we're going to break through this logjam and not just keep talking about constitutional amendments. We're going to get it done. So that's the strategic background to this. We have had very positive follow-up and actually been something of a matchmaker to get the sort of lead Democrats and the lead Republicans actually having conversations with each other about some of the finer points of the wording and things like that. But we're hopeful and know that, this investment we've all made in the discipline, cross-partisan, Business for American Promise, the Rotary presentation, and I don't know if you mentioned Howard and Judy, both involved in leadership in the Rotaries and their communities. So, this works to be effective advocates. And so I just want to thank you. There's more to follow, but I am very hopeful. We have reason to be hopeful that even in this time of crisis, we'll be able to see an initiative in Washington that really plants the flag for cross-partisan big reform and the kind of, working across the aisle that Neal rightly says we have to find our way back to if we're going to get anything done. So thanks.
Pleasure.
By the way, your Rotary presentation was excellent. It gave really good background material. We just loaded up the PowerPoint and it was really, and Howard, you can attest to this, it was really easy to do, and it was impactful.
Well, I thank you for that review, Judy. On behalf of the American Promise, team members around the country who worked on that, right now on my screen, I see Don Bender in the Kansas City area, and know he's been a big part of developing those resources, and Susan Muller, Elizabeth Doty. So I hope they're on the call and enjoying the big kudos. Want to open it up for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anyone has a question, again, a big part of the Grassroots Victory is the opportunity to, learn from people also on the front lines. If you have a question, you can go to participants and then raise your hand, or enter it into the chat and I can relay it. And Cynthia, if I could ask you if I'm scrolling through. A shy bunch, or everyone's hand raise has gotten stuck. I'll give it a couple more seconds. A question that came to mind for me, Judy and Howard, was, you talked about going from the Rotary presentation before the meeting. How did that help you guys? Was it a matter of, finding your own voice, or, in what way did that help kind of prepare you for your meeting with Mike Gallagher?
First of all, our Rotary makes a point of being nonpartisan. So I was a little hesitant at making the presentation, but I recall saying to Howard, if we pull this off well, no one will know which one of us is a Republican and which one of us is a Democrat. And we managed to do that. And I think we were both surprised with how supportive everybody was in regards to changing the pay to play situation. It didn't make any difference what political conviction they had. And Howard, you can certainly express your feelings.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. To answer Kimberly's question, part of my many different hats that I've worn over the years, in the selling business, in the selling activities, you never start off with going to the top client with the first pitch. You want to practice in a smaller environment, and Rotary was an excellent place to do that. We were among friends, but also critical friends, people that expect a good presentation and something worthwhile. And so it was a good environment for us to, as you said, Kimberly, find our voice, and find out, what worked, what felt good. And it certainly did, help with the preparation before we talked to Representative Gallagher.
Awesome. Thank you for the insight and the business lesson. I see Mary Milburn Pierce has her hand up. Curious if we can get her off mute, and that might be our last question for the night.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. So as somebody who's just attending the first call of this group, and actually I've just joined American Promise mainly because of the book club, sparked my interest. I made a Mother's Day pledge to my 5 adult children that I would try to fix the country, if nothing else, that I could do for them. So what would you like people who are new to the group to know, I guess? What are the steps going forward, and how can people quickly kind of come up to speed?
Kimberly, you want me to jump in first on that?
Well, I was going to say, we can, but I'm curious, Howard and Judy, do you guys want to give your,
I was just going to, can we just ask where Mary's from?
I'm from Seattle, Washington.
Seattle, thank you. Take it away, Howard.
That's an easy answer for me. Because the Rotary thing was Judy asked me, I don't know, maybe a month before that. So I am extremely new to the organization and to the effort. But it's what's in your heart that's important. If it's what you believe, if it feels right, and it's in your gut, that's all you need to know. The rest is just detail.
And I have to reinforce what you had said, Howard, because I asked 2 people before I asked you, and it wasn't in their heart. And that makes all the difference in the world.
That's the key.
That's the key.
And Jeff, do you want to give your 3 cents?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Mary. Stay tuned in the newsletters. You'll see a lot of good examples, but we are about empowerment. So let us know how we can help serve you and make your efforts in Seattle more effective. And so we have a candidate pledge, we have chapter building efforts, we have business for American Promise, we have healthcare for American Promise, thanks to Marie and others who are on this call. So it really depends on where you're coming from. We want to be responsive to make you the most effective citizen advocate you can be. So feel free to reach out to either Kimberly or me, Jeff C. at AmericanPromise.net and Kimberly C. at AmericanPromise.net, and just stay on top of what we're doing. And the newsletter comes out every 2 weeks on Thursday, but there's really a lot going on, but we try to really make it what works for you rather than a cookie cutter approach.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you again. I like your Mother's Day pledge.
Awesome.
Yes, indeed, that question is a great segue to wrapping up the call. I promise we did not plant Mary and tell her to ask that question, but it is a great reminder for me to tell everyone, if you are here and part of American Promise, thank you so much for the work that you are doing to give all Americans voice in our government and keep it up. And if you are new, thank you for the work that I am sure you are already doing for having the optimism to join this call tonight. And what you can definitely do tomorrow is go to AmericanPromise.net, take action and contact your elected officials and just express your personal support for this amendment. And then if, like Mary, you have made a Mother's Day pledge to take action, you can send me an email at kimberlyc@americanpromise.net. But for now, please, give yourselves a pat on the back, and maybe we can all give each other some thumbs up and spirit fingers.
And big thanks to Neal and our partners, Issue One and Unite America, Congressional Management Foundation, the Center for the Study of Presidency and Congress, Howard and Judy, and all of you. Thank you.